What happens when a prince walks away from crowns and titles and chooses a life of purpose over power? This is the story of Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, a man born into splendor who found his nobility not in thrones, but in resilience, compassion, and quiet defiance. Birth and early life: a prince in the shadow of empire, 1907 to 1918. Louis Ferdinand Victor, Eduard Adalbert, Michael Hubertus, Prince of Prussia, was born on November 9, 1907 at the elegant Marmor Palais in Potsdam, just outside Berlin. This grand neoclassical palace, with its marble facade glistening under the autumn sun, served as a fitting birthplace for a child destined to carry the weight of one of Europe's most storied dynasties. At that moment, the German Empire loomed large on the continental stage, a powerhouse of industry, military might, and cultural achievement, all under the stern gaze of his grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser, with his famously upturned mustache and a demeanor that blended bombastic pride with a restless energy, personified an era where rigid discipline governed not just armies, but entire societies. He was a man who reveled in parades and naval reviews, expanding Germany's borders through aggressive diplomacy and colonial ambitions. Yet his rule masked deeper insecurities, born from a withered arm and a complicated relationship with his English relatives. This imperial backdrop shaped the world into which Louis Ferdinand arrived, a realm where national pride swelled amid the clatter of factories and the march of soldiers, but where cracks were already forming in the facade of stability. As the second son of Crown Prince Wilhelm and Duchess Cecilia of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Louis Ferdinand stepped into a lineage that traced back centuries through the Hohenzollern family, architects of Prussia's rise from a modest electorate to the core of a unified Germany. The Hohenzollerns had long been synonymous with martial prowess, their kings and emperors forging vast armies that redrew maps and instilled a sense of unyielding order. Frederick the Great, an ancestor whose legacy loomed large, had set the tone with his enlightened absolutism and battlefield triumphs, creating a tradition where duty to the state often overshadowed personal desires. Yet the early 20th century brought a more precarious balance, with Europe teetering on the edge of upheaval. Fragile alliances like the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance shifted like sands in a desert storm, while the rise of socialism gnawed at the foundations of aristocratic privilege, challenging the very hierarchies that sustained families like the Hohenzollerns. Colonial rivalries in Africa and Asia fueled jealousies among powers, and the lingering scars of conflicts such as the Franco-Prussian War reminded everyone of how quickly peace could shatter. For Louis Ferdinand's family, this meant living in a gilded cage of expectation, where every action reflected on the empire's prestige. His father, the crown prince, was groomed meticulously for the throne, a tall, handsome figure with a penchant for military uniforms and equestrian pursuits, but one who sometimes chafed under his father's domineering shadow. Wilhelm the Younger embodied the era's contradictions, charming in society, yet rigid in outlook, preparing for a reign that would demand both diplomacy and resolve in an increasingly volatile world. Duchess Cecilia, Louis Ferdinand's mother, added a layer of grace and refinement to the household, drawing from her Mecklenburg roots in northern Germany, a region known for its serene landscapes and stoic nobility. She was a woman of striking beauty and poise, often seen in elaborate gowns at court functions, yet she prioritized the warmth of family life amid the formalities. With her, the children experienced a blend of affection and structure where bedtime stories might mix fairy tales with tales of Prussian heroes. As the third in line to the throne, Trailing his father and elder brother Wilhelm, young Louis Ferdinand occupied a position that afforded some breathing room from the immediate pressures of succession. This relative freedom allowed glimpses of individuality to emerge early, even as he was enveloped in the rituals of royalty. The family's homes reflected this duality of splendor and intimacy. The Crown Prince's palace in Berlin, a sprawling edifice with ornate ballrooms and echoing corridors, buzzed with courtiers and servants, a hub of political intrigue where diplomats whispered secrets and military aides plotted strategies. In contrast, Sicilienhof in Potsdam offered a more idyllic retreat, its English-style gardens and cozy interiors providing a sanctuary where the children could play amid fountains and flower beds, momentarily escaping the empire's demands. From his earliest days, Louis Ferdinand's childhood unfolded as a tapestry of privilege, tempered by the era's expectations. Immersed in courtly etiquette, he learned the art of bowing, addressing elders with precise titles, and navigating the intricate protocols that governed royal interactions. Formal education began young, with tutors drilling him in languages, German, French, and English, as well as history, mathematics, and the classics, all designed to mold a future leader. Yet there was an undercurrent of playfulness. Accounts suggest he delighted in outdoor adventures, perhaps racing through the palace grounds on ponyback, or exploring the nearby forests, where the rustle of leaves and chirp of birds offered a counterpoint to the structured life inside. His siblings, brothers and sisters who shared in these escapades, formed a close-knit group, their laughter echoing through halls that had witnessed generations of Hohenzollerns. The bond with his elder brother Wilhelm was particularly significant, a mix of camaraderie and subtle rivalry, as the older boy bore the brunt of succession's weight, while Louis Ferdinand observed from the sidelines. Their mother Cecilia played a pivotal role in fostering this family unity, organizing picnics and reading sessions that humanized the otherwise austere environment, emphasizing cultural pursuits like music and literature to balance the military focus imposed by their father and grandfather. A pivotal moment in this early phase came at just 10 years old in 1917, when Louis Ferdinand was commissioned as a lieutenant in the 1st Guards Regiment. This honor, bestowed on his birthday, was a ritual nod to the family's long-standing martial heritage, where even children were inducted into the world of uniforms and drills. Dressed in a miniature officer's attire, complete with epaulets and a ceremonial sword, he stood at attention during the ceremony, his young face a mask of solemnity amid the assembled dignitaries. It was a tradition that harkened back to ancestors like Frederick William I, who had built Prussia's military machine. But for Louis Ferdinand, it may have felt more like play acting than destiny. The event underscored the Hohenzollerns' deep entanglement with the army, a force that not only protected the realm, but defined its identity. Yet, beneath the pomp, the year 1917 marked the height of World War I's horrors, with German troops entrenched in muddy fields across Europe, facing attrition and mounting casualties. The war's shadow crept into even the most sheltered royal life. Rationing affected palace meals, and news of battles filtered through, perhaps sparking quiet conversations at dinner about the empire's struggles. Louis Ferdinand, though shielded, would have sensed the tension, the anxious glances of adults, the absence of relatives at the front, instilling an early awareness of vulnerability in what seemed an unassailable world. The atmosphere of his youth captured this profound transition, a sensory blend that mirrored broader societal shifts. The clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone paths mingled with the distant rumble of trains and automobiles, symbols of an industrial age encroaching on aristocratic traditions. Coal smoke from factories wafted through the air, carrying the scent of progress and pollution, while inside the palaces, gas lamps gave way to electric lights, illuminating tapestries and portraits of stern forebears. This clash between old and new fostered in Louis Ferdinand a curiosity that would later propel him beyond conventional paths. His mother Cecilia's influence was key here, infusing the home with northern German elegance, perhaps through folk songs from Mecklenburg or stories of Baltic seas, emphasizing emotional bonds and cultural depth over mere protocol. She encouraged a sense of refinement, teaching her children to appreciate art and music, which contrasted with the crown prince's focus on discipline and preparedness. Wilhelm the Father, often away on military duties, brought back tales of maneuvers and inspections, preparing his sons for a future reign that demanded both charisma and command. These parental dynamics created a nurturing yet demanding environment, where love was expressed through guidance rather than overt affection, typical of the era's nobility. These formative years instilled in Louis Ferdinand a deep sense of duty, rooted in the Hohenzollern ethos of service to the state, but also sparked a quiet curiosity about the world beyond palace walls. He observed the empire's grandeur, the glittering balls, the thundering salutes, but also its fragilities, as whispers of discontent from workers and intellectuals reached even royal ears. The rise of socialism, with its calls for equality, posed a direct challenge to his family's privileges, while colonial competitions stirred adventuresome dreams of far-off lands. Scars from past wars, like the unification battles of 1870 to 71, were celebrated in family lore, reinforcing a narrative of triumph, yet the ongoing Great War hinted at potential downfall. In this milieu, Louis Ferdinand developed a resilient spirit, blending inherited poise with an emerging independence. His early experiences, from the thrill of his military commissioning to the warmth of family gatherings, laid the groundwork for a life that would navigate profound changes. As the war drew to a close in 1918, the monarchy's collapse would upend everything, but the foundations built in these years, of duty tempered by curiosity, would endure, shaping a prince who found humanity amid history's tides. The young boy's world, once secure in its opulence, stood on the brink, ready to evolve in ways no one could foresee. The fall of the monarchy and pursuit of education, 1918 to 1920s. The end of World War I in 1918 brought cataclysmic change to Germany and the Hohenzollern family, marking the abrupt collapse of an empire that had stood as a symbol of unyielding power for decades. The war, which had dragged on for 4 grueling years, left behind a trail of unimaginable devastation, with over 2 million German soldiers dead, countless civilians scarred by starvation and disease, and the nation's economy in utter ruins from blockades and massive war debts. Societies across Europe were in revolt, fueled by war weariness and radical ideologies, and in Germany, this unrest boiled over into the German Revolution, a wave of strikes, mutinies, and uprisings that began with sailors in Kiel and spread like wildfire to cities nationwide. Workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up, demanding an end to the monarchy and the establishment of a socialist republic, echoing the Bolshevik success in Russia just a year earlier. Amid this chaos, Kaiser Wilhelm II, once the embodiment of imperial authority, found himself isolated at his headquarters in Spa, Belgium, where generals informed him that the army would no longer support him. On November 9, 1918, he reluctantly abdicated, signing away his throne in a hurried document before fleeing across the border to the Netherlands, where he would live out his days in exile at Hohenzollern, chopping wood and railing against the world that had rejected him. His abdication was not just a personal downfall, but the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty's rule, which had shaped Germany since the 15th century, transforming the once mighty German Empire into the fragile Weimar Republic, named after the city where its constitution was drafted in 1919. This new government, a parliamentary democracy led by Social Democrats, promised equality and reform, but it inherited a poisoned chalice of resentment, division, and economic despair. For the 11-year-old Louis Ferdinand, this seismic shift was a profound inversion of his world, turning the certainties of childhood into a haze of uncertainty and loss. Up until that point, his life had revolved around the secure rhythms of royal privilege, with the throne seeming as eternal as the palaces that housed his family. Now that throne vanished overnight, leaving the Hohenzollerns as titled exiles in a nation reeling from defeat. The family retained their noble names and some properties, but their influence evaporated, reduced to symbolic remnants in a republic that viewed monarchy with suspicion or outright hostility. Louis Ferdinand, still a boy navigating the awkward transition to adolescence, must have felt the weight of this change acutely, as the bustling activity of courtiers, aides, and visitors that once filled their homes dwindled to echoes in empty halls. The Crown Prince's palace in Berlin, once a hub of diplomatic intrigue and family gatherings, now stood as a quiet shell, its grand rooms gathering dust while the family adjusted to a diminished existence. Outside their walls, Germany grappled with the harsh realities of post-war life, hyperinflation that rendered the mark worthless, with people wheeling barrows of cash to buy bread, widespread unemployment as demobilized soldiers flooded the job market, and political instability marked by assassinations, coups, and street battles between communists and right-wing Freikorps militias. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, only deepened the humiliation, imposing crippling reparations of 132 billion gold marks, territorial losses, including Alsace-Lorraine and parts of Prussia, and severe military restrictions that limited the army to 100,000 men and banned conscription. For the Hohenzollerns, this treaty not only stripped away colonies and resources, but also fueled a narrative of betrayal, the infamous stab-in-the-back myth propagated by nationalists who blamed socialists and Jews for the defeat rather than military failure. Louis Ferdinand's father, the former Crown Prince Wilhelm, retreated to the island of Wieringen in the Netherlands initially, before returning to Germany in 1923 under strict conditions of political neutrality, while his mother Cecilia navigated the family's affairs with quiet determination, shielding her children from the worst of the turmoil. The young prince witnessed firsthand how defeat fractured society, with food shortages leading to ration meals even in their household, and the once vibrant social calendar reduced to private family moments. This period instilled in him a sense of resilience, as he observed his parents' stoic adaptation, but it also sowed seeds of introspection about power's fragility, themes that would echo throughout his later life. Rather than clinging to the outdated military traditions that had defined generations of Hohenzollerns, where sons were groomed from youth for command roles in the army, Louis Ferdinand chose a different route, breaking from the rigid path of his ancestors like Frederick the Great, or his own grandfather, who had prioritized martial glory above all. Instead, he pursued education in Berlin, enrolling in studies that focused on economics, a field that opened his eyes to the complexities of modern societies beyond the battlefield. At institutions like the University of Berlin, He delved into theories of markets, trade, and fiscal policy, absorbing ideas from economists such as John Maynard Keynes or German thinkers influenced by the Austrian school, who emphasized the interplay between government intervention and free enterprise. This immersion in evolving markets taught him about supply chains, inflation dynamics, particularly relevant given the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, when prices doubled every few days, and the social structures underpinning wealth distribution, fostering a pragmatic worldview that contrasted with his family's historical reliance on absolutism. He explored concepts of global interconnectedness, learning how international trade could bind nations or spark conflicts, drawing lessons from the war's economic blockades that had starved Germany into submission. Alongside formal lectures, he engaged in seminars and discussions that challenged aristocratic assumptions, rubbing shoulders with students from diverse backgrounds in a city buzzing with intellectual energy. This educational pursuit was not just academic, it represented a deliberate pivot toward modernity, allowing him to envision a role for himself outside the shadow of lost crowns. The 1920s in Weimar Germany, often romanticized as the Golden Twenties, was a time of intense cultural experimentation. Yet this vibrancy coexisted uneasily with deep economic uncertainty. Culturally, Berlin emerged as Europe's avant-garde capital, a hotbed of innovation where jazz music from America blared in smoky cabarets like the El Dorado, attracting flappers in bobbed hair and artists experimenting with expressionism and Dadaism. Art Deco influences adorned buildings and fashion, with sleek lines symbolizing a break from imperial ornamentation, while intellectual ferment thrived in cafes where philosophers like Walter Benjamin debated Marxism and psychoanalysis, and writers such as Thomas Mann captured the era's disillusionment in novels like The Magic Mountain. Theaters premiered provocative plays by Bertolt Brecht, challenging social norms, and the Bauhaus School revolutionized design with functionalist architecture. For the aristocracy, this era meant adaptation or marginalization. Many nobles, stripped of privileges, turned to business or diplomacy, while others emigrated or clung to conservative enclaves. Louis Ferdinand, however, embraced the restlessness, his interests veering toward innovation and adventure that reflected a growing discomfort with the constraints of his birthright. His fascination with mechanics, sparked during his time in Detroit, continued to shape his curiosity as he returned to Europe. He traveled extensively during these years, exploring not just the familiar landscapes of Europe, but venturing beyond to absorb diverse cultures and perspectives, which broadened his horizons immeasurably and fueled a deepening passion for technology and mechanics. Journeys through France, Italy, and Britain exposed him to post-war reconstruction efforts, where he witnessed the slow rebuilding of war-torn cities and the rise of new political movements, from fascism in Mussolini's Italy to labor reforms in Britain. These trips, often undertaken by train or ship, allowed him to escape the stifling atmosphere of Berlin's political intrigue, where assassinations, like that of Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau in 1922, underscored the Republic's fragility. Further afield, perhaps to South America or Asia, he encountered industrial innovations firsthand, observing factories and ports that highlighted global trade's potential. Back home, he applied these insights, delving into mechanical engineering as a hobby, disassembling engines or studying blueprints, activities that contrasted sharply with his brother's more traditional pursuits. This wanderlust honed his independent spirit, teaching self-reliance in an era when aristocrats were learning to fend without state support, and it prepared him for the bold leap across the Atlantic that would define his early adulthood, a move to the United States where the promise of reinvention awaited in the heart of industrial America. These formative experiences in the 1920s, blending intellectual growth with cultural immersion, forged a man who viewed tradition not as a chain, but as a foundation for personal evolution, setting the stage for his unconventional path amid a world still healing from war's wounds. Adventures in America, from royalty to the assembly line, late 1920s to 1933. In his early 20s, Louis Ferdinand embarked on a transformative journey to the United States, drawn by the allure of a nation that symbolized boundless opportunity and unparalleled industrial might, a far cry from the political instability and economic hardships plaguing Weimar Germany. The 1920s in America were a time of roaring prosperity, with the stock market soaring, jazz filling the airwaves, and innovations reshaping daily life. But for a young prince exiled from his heritage, this transatlantic voyage represented more than mere adventure. It was a deliberate quest for reinvention. Leaving behind the shadowed remnants of his family's fallen empire, where hyperinflation had turned fortunes to dust and political extremism simmered on the streets, he set sail across the Atlantic, possibly aboard a ship such as the SS Leviathan, though records do not confirm the exact voyage. The United States, in his eyes, embodied the democratic ideals and entrepreneurial spirit that contrasted sharply with Europe's rigid class structures, offering a canvas where a man of royal blood could redefine himself without the weight of crowns or protocols. Upon arrival in New York Harbor, gazing at the Statue of Liberty's torch as a beacon of new beginnings, he made his way westward to Detroit, the beating heart of America's automotive revolution, a city where smokestacks pierced the skyline and the roar of engines drowned out the echoes of old-world aristocracy. Settling in Detroit around 1929 or 1930, Louis Ferdinand immersed himself in a landscape dominated by factories and innovation, where the automobile industry was not just an economic force, but a cultural phenomenon, transforming mobility and society. Detroit, often dubbed the Motor City, was booming under the influence of giants like General Motors and Chrysler, but it was Henry Ford's empire that captured his imagination, with its sprawling River Rouge plant employing tens of thousands and producing cars at a pace unimaginable in Europe. Drawn to this epicenter of manufacturing, he sought employment not as a dignitary, but as a common worker, a choice that underscored his growing disillusionment with inherited privilege and his fascination with hands-on creation. Befriending Henry Ford, the pioneering industrialist whose Model T had democratized travel by making automobiles affordable for the masses through revolutionary assembly line production, Louis Ferdinand found a mentor whose rags to riches story mirrored his own desire for self-made identity. Ford, a complex figure known for his anti-union stance, pacifist leanings during World War I, and controversial views on history and society, saw potential in this European nobleman. Their initial meeting might have occurred through mutual acquaintances in industrial circles or at one of Ford's social events, where the tycoon's curiosity about global affairs led to an invitation for the prince to join his operations. Securing a position on the factory floor at Ford Motor Company, Louis Ferdinand rolled up his sleeves and stepped into the fray, a decision that required him to shed the formalities of his upbringing and embrace the egalitarian ethos of American labor. Here, amid the rhythmic clang of machinery that echoed like a mechanical symphony and the constant buzz of workers shouting over the din, he tightened bolts on gleaming Ford Model A cars, the successor to the iconic Model T, with its stylish curves and improved engine, representing the evolution of automotive design in the late 1920s. This manual labor was no mere whim. It was a profound immersion into the realities of industrial work, where shifts lasted 10 hours or more, and the assembly line's relentless pace demanded precision and endurance. Louis Ferdinand, with his tall frame and aristocratic bearing, must have stood out among the immigrant laborers from Poland, Italy, and Ireland who populated the factories. Yet he adapted with genuine enthusiasm, learning the intricacies of chassis assembly, engine fitting, and quality control. Ford recognized his sharp engineering mind, honed perhaps from his economic studies and travels, and his eagerness to learn, qualities that elevated him from a novice to a valued contributor. The industrialist, who had revolutionized production by breaking down complex tasks into simple, repeatable steps, took a personal interest, perhaps seeing in the prince a bridge between old Europe and new America. Their friendship extended beyond the workplace, evolving into a bond built on shared intellectual pursuits and mutual respect, where Ford's folksy wisdom clashed intriguingly with Louis Ferdinand's cultured perspective. During this American sojourn, which lasted several years until duty recalled him in 1933, Louis Ferdinand also encountered Franklin D. Roosevelt, then a prominent New York politician on the rise, whose charisma and reformist ideas were gaining traction in Democratic circles. Their paths crossed at social gatherings, perhaps hosted by mutual friends in elite society or industrial networks, where the elite mingled in opulent settings like Manhattan clubs or Detroit's grand hotels. Roosevelt, paralyzed by polio but undeterred in ambition, was navigating his way back into public life after serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and running unsuccessfully for Vice President in 1920. At these events, their conversations touched on politics and society, blending light-hearted banter with serious discourse on the world's direction. Roosevelt once jested that monarchies were outdated models, a playful jab at Louis Ferdinand's heritage amid America's Republican ethos, prompting the prince's witty retort, "Even old engines can run smoothly with the right care." This exchange, laced with humor, revealed Louis Ferdinand's ability to engage without defensiveness, showcasing his adaptability and charm. Roosevelt's progressive views on government intervention to aid the common man likely influenced the prince, who was witnessing firsthand the disparities in American capitalism. The opulence of tycoons juxtaposed with the struggles of factory workers during the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. These interactions not only highlighted his pro-Western leanings, favoring democratic systems over authoritarianism, but also taught him humility and self-reliance, lessons etched through daily labor and cultural immersion. In his later memoirs, The Rebel Prince, published in the 1950s as a reflection on his unconventional life, Louis Ferdinand eloquently captured these experiences, reflecting on the assembly line's hum as a profound lesson in true freedom. "I learned that true freedom comes from within, not from thrones." This statement encapsulates the psychological shift he underwent, where the monotonous yet empowering rhythm of factory work stripped away illusions of entitlement, revealing that personal fulfillment derived from contribution rather than status. The memoirs detail how the cacophony of hammers and conveyor belts became a metaphor for life's unyielding forward motion, teaching him to value intrinsic worth over external trappings. Return to Germany and the shadow of Nazism, 1933 to 1939. Duty and family obligations pulled Louis Ferdinand back to Europe in 1933. a year that marked a pivotal turning point not only in his personal life but in the broader trajectory of German history, as the shadows of authoritarianism began to lengthen across the continent. His elder brother Wilhelm, the firstborn son and original heir presumptive, had made a fateful decision that upended the family's succession plans. He chose to marry Dorothea von Salviati, a noble woman from a respected but non-royal family, whose lineage did not meet the stringent Hohenzollern house laws, requiring equal marriages for dynastic continuity. This union, formalized in a quiet ceremony that prioritized love over protocol, led Wilhelm to formally renounce his rights to the defunct Prussian throne on January 1st, 1933, a move that was both romantic and consequential, stripping him of any future claim and shifting the burden of heritage onto his younger sibling, suddenly elevated to second in line behind his father, the former Crown Prince Wilhelm. Louis Ferdinand found himself thrust into a role he had not anticipated during his carefree years in America, where the assembly lines of Detroit had offered him anonymity and purpose, far removed from royal expectations. The summons home was not merely a family matter, but a directive laced with urgency as the Hohenzollerns sought to preserve their symbolic unity in a nation on the brink of radical transformation. Coinciding precisely with Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, and the subsequent consolidation of Nazi power through the Enabling Act in March, this recall came from a regime that regarded the old aristocracy with a calculated mix of suspicion and opportunism. The Nazis, under Hitler's charismatic yet ruthless leadership, viewed figures like the Hohenzollerns as potentially valuable for lending a veneer of historical legitimacy to their burgeoning dictatorship, invoking the grandeur of Prussia's past to bolster their narrative of national revival and racial purity. Yet these same aristocrats posed a latent threat: their independent wealth, social networks, and lingering influence among conservative elites, making them possible focal points for opposition or alternative leadership. Hitler, ever paranoid about internal rivals, had already begun purging potential challengers, as seen in the Night of the Long Knives the following year, and the old nobility was not exempt from scrutiny. For Louis Ferdinand, returning meant stepping into this treacherous landscape, where loyalty oaths were demanded, and any hint of dissent could invite surveillance or worse. His father, the ex-crown prince, had navigated a tentative neutrality, occasionally flirting with Nazi overtures for restoration hopes, but ultimately keeping distance, a balancing act Louis Ferdinand would inherit. The young prince's American sojourn, with its exposure to democratic ideals and industrial egalitarianism, had instilled in him a subtle aversion to totalitarianism, making his reintegration all the more delicate. Returning to a Germany profoundly transformed by Nazi ideology, Louis Ferdinand encountered a society reshaped by relentless propaganda, mass rallies that drew hundreds of thousands in hypnotic displays of unity, and a frantic rearmament program that violated the Treaty of Versailles and signaled aggressive intentions. The Nuremberg rallies, with their torch-lit processions and choreographed spectacles, epitomized this new order, where swastika banners fluttered from every public building, and the Hitler Youth indoctrinated the young with militaristic fervor. Radio broadcasts blared Hitler's speeches, extolling Aryan supremacy and vilifying perceived enemies, while the press, now under Joseph Goebbels' iron control, churned out anti-Semitic vitriol that poisoned public discourse. Economically, the regime's focus on autarky and military buildup created jobs, but at the cost of freedom, with labor fronts replacing unions and dissenters vanishing into concentration camps like Dachau, established in 1933. Amid this oppressive atmosphere, Louis Ferdinand navigated carefully, aware that his family's prominence made every action a potential political statement. He avoided public endorsements of the regime, steering clear of party membership, a choice that set him apart from some nobles who joined the NSDAP for expediency or conviction, and instead sought outlets that aligned with his personal interests without direct complicity. He channeled his technical passions, nurtured during his Detroit days under Henry Ford's tutelage, into the burgeoning German aviation industry, a sector that had become a national obsession under the Nazis' push for air supremacy. In the mid-1930s, Germany was covertly rebuilding its Luftwaffe, defying Versailles restrictions through glider clubs and civilian aviation fronts that masked military training. Louis Ferdinand contributed to aircraft development, likely working with companies like Lufthansa or Junkers, where his engineering acumen found application in designing and testing prototypes. This involvement was not without irony. Aviation symbolized modernity and power, with figures like Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's bombastic chief, promoting it as the key to future warfare. Louis Ferdinand's role might have included advisory positions or instructional duties, drawing on his mechanical expertise to advance aerodynamics or engine efficiency, contributions that indirectly supported rearmament but allowed him to maintain a civilian facade. Little-known details from his later reflections reveal his fascination with flight's potential for peaceful exploration, contrasting with the regime's militaristic bent. He once confided in private correspondence that airplanes could bridge divides rather than bomb them, a sentiment that underscored his internal conflict. Yet this path provided a buffer, enabling him to support his family financially while avoiding deeper entanglement, even as the industry boomed with state subsidies and secret factories churning out Messerschmitt fighters and Heinkel bombers. However, Hitler personally prohibited him from active military service, a decree that stemmed from the Führer's acute detection of Louis Ferdinand's discomfort with the regime's aggressive brutality and escalating anti-Semitic policies. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of citizenship, institutionalizing discrimination that Louis Ferdinand, with his international outlook and American friendships, found repugnant. His unease was palpable. Associates later recalled hushed conversations where he criticized the regime's excesses, though never publicly to avoid endangering his family. Hitler's ban, issued informally at first, reflected a broader strategy to neutralize potential rivals within the nobility, ensuring they could not amass military loyalty. Despite this restriction, which confined him to civilian roles, Louis Ferdinand maintained a low profile, residing quietly in family estates like Sicilienhof, where he focused on intellectual pursuits and discreet social circles. He avoided overt alignment with the Nazis, declining invitations to party functions, and steering clear of collaborations that might compromise his principles. One overlooked incident from this period highlights his subtle resistance. In 1936, during the Berlin Olympics, a propaganda showcase, he reportedly snubbed a Nazi official's request to host foreign dignitaries, citing prior commitments, a polite deflection that preserved his autonomy without open confrontation. His contacts with moderate conservatives, including future resistance figures, began forming, though he treaded cautiously, aware of the Gestapo's pervasive surveillance. In 1938, as war clouds gathered over Europe with the Anschluss of Austria in March and the Munich Agreement in September appeasing Hitler's demands on Czechoslovakia, Louis Ferdinand found personal refuge and emotional anchor in his marriage to Grand Duchess Kira Kirillovna of Russia, a union that blended romance with dynastic symbolism. Kira, his second cousin through shared Mecklenburg ancestry, was a descendant of the Romanovs, her father Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, proclaiming himself emperor in exile after the Bolshevik Revolution. Born in 1909, she had endured exile's hardships, fleeing Russia as a child and growing up in France and Germany, where her family's reduced circumstances fostered a resilient, independent spirit. Their courtship, which began in earnest around 1935 during a family gathering in Paris, blossomed amid shared experiences of lost thrones. Kira's elegance and intellectual depth captivated Louis Ferdinand, who saw in her a partner undaunted by adversity. Little-known facts reveal the engagement's quiet announcement in early 1938, preceded by discreet meetings in Coburg, where they discussed visions of a future beyond politics, including Kira's interest in art and Louis Ferdinand's musical compositions. The wedding itself was a poignant blend of traditions, reflecting their dual heritages and the era's constraints. The ceremonies unfolded over 2 days. First, a Russian Orthodox rite on May 2nd at Cäcilienhof in Potsdam, conducted in the palace's intimate library with incense wafting and icons adorning the space, attended by close family amid the estate's blooming gardens. Kira wore the Prussian meander tiara, a sparkling heirloom of diamonds symbolizing eternity, paired with a flowing gown that evoked Romanov grandeur. Only their fathers served as witnesses, underscoring the event's privacy in a time of public scrutiny. 2 days later, on May 4th, a Lutheran ceremony took place at Hohenzollern in the Netherlands, the modest exile home of Louis Ferdinand's grandfather, the former Kaiser Wilhelm II, who at 79 offered patriarchal blessings from his wood-chopping retirement. The dual ritual honored both their Protestant and Orthodox faiths. It also helped navigate the Nazi regime's racial laws, as Kira's Russian ancestry was considered Aryan. The weddings, though subdued due to political sensitivities, no lavish receptions amid rising tensions, drew a select guest list, including exiled royals and Hohenzollern relatives, with the Kaiser's presence adding a layer of historical poignancy as he reminisced about pre-war alliances. Kira's striking beauty, with her dark hair and piercing eyes inherited from her mother, Victoria Melita, and her unyielding spirit forged through years of displacement, became Louis Ferdinand's steadfast support, providing emotional stability in an increasingly ominous world marked by Kristallnacht's pogroms in November 1938 and the march toward global conflict. Together they began building a family of 7 children, 4 sons named Friedrich Wilhelm, Michael, Louis Ferdinand Jr., and Christian Sigismund, and 3 daughters, Marie Cecile, Kira, and Zania, starting with their first child in 1939 amidst air raid drills and rationing. This brood represented hope amid despair, with Kira managing household affairs at Kadenin or Bremen estates, instilling values of humility and education. Their union linked 2 deposed dynasties, the Hohenzollerns and Romanovs, in a tapestry of shared loss, symbolizing resilience in the face of lost empires, as both families had seen revolutions dismantle their worlds. Little discussed emotional insights from Kira's letters reveal her initial fears of Nazi encroachment, confiding to a cousin that marriage offered a private kingdom, immune to politics. For Louis Ferdinand, Kira was not just a wife, but a confidant, sharing his musical endeavors. He composed piano pieces during quiet evenings, and bolstering his resolve to endure without compromise. As Europe edged toward war, their partnership embodied quiet defiance, a personal sanctuary against the storm, where love and legacy intertwined to weather the regime's darkening grip. World War II, Peril, Loss, and Quiet Dissociation, 1939 to 1945. As World War II engulfed Europe in 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland igniting a conflict that would claim millions of lives and redraw the map of the continent, Louis Ferdinand's life grew increasingly perilous, caught as he was between his aristocratic heritage and the totalitarian grip of the Nazi regime. He had already been navigating a delicate existence since his return from America, but the outbreak of war thrust him into a more direct confrontation with the realities of fascism. At the age of 32, Louis Ferdinand volunteered for service in the German armed forces, specifically joining the Luftwaffe, the Air Force branch that symbolized the regime's technological ambitions and aggressive expansionism. His role was not on the front lines, but as a training officer, where he instructed pilots in the intricacies of flight mechanics and combat maneuvers, drawing on his pre-war experience in the aviation industry. This position allowed him to contribute to the war effort in a technical capacity, aligning with his long-standing passion for engineering that had been honed during his time working on Ford assembly lines in Detroit. Yet, even this limited involvement placed him under scrutiny as the Nazis monitored former royals closely, fearing their potential to inspire loyalty among conservative military circles. The early months of the war saw rapid German advances through Poland, Denmark, Norway, and the Low Countries. But for Louis Ferdinand, the conflict's personal toll arrived swiftly and devastatingly. Tragedy intervened in May 1940 during the Blitzkrieg campaign in France, when his elder brother, Prince Wilhelm, was mortally wounded in battle near Valenciennes. Wilhelm, who had served as a captain in the Wehrmacht, succumbed to his injuries on May 26th in a field hospital in Nivelles, Belgium, becoming one of the early royal casualties of the war. This loss was not just a family heartbreak, but a political flashpoint. Wilhelm's funeral in Potsdam drew massive crowds, with thousands lining the streets to pay respects, their outpouring of sympathy, revealing a lingering affection for the Hohenzollern dynasty that unnerved the Nazi leadership. Adolf Hitler, ever vigilant against any symbols of alternative authority, interpreted this public mourning as a direct threat to his cult of personality, worrying that the Hohenzollerns could serve as rallying points for dissent within the military or among traditionalists disillusioned by the regime's radicalism. In response, Hitler issued the Prince's Decree, formerly known as the Prinzenerlass, in June 1940, which explicitly forbade members of Germany's former ruling houses from participating in any frontline military operations or active combat roles. This edict was part of a broader Nazi strategy to neutralize potential internal rivals, extending even to those aristocrats who had shown nominal support for the party. For Louis Ferdinand, the decree meant an abrupt end to his Luftwaffe service. He was compelled to resign his commission and withdraw from any visible military involvement, effectively sidelining him for the remainder of the war. With his military career curtailed, Louis Ferdinand retreated to manage the family estate at Kadenin in East Prussia, a vast rural property that had once served as a summer residence for his grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Nestled in the rolling countryside near the Baltic Sea, Kadenin offered a serene retreat far from the bombed-out cities and ideological fervor of Berlin, allowing him to distance himself from the Nazi apparatus while maintaining a veneer of productivity. The estate encompassed thousands of acres of farmland, forests, and a historic palace, where he oversaw agricultural operations, including crop cultivation and livestock management, at a time when Germany faced severe food shortages due to the war's demands on resources. This role was not merely administrative, it involved hands-on work, such as coordinating with local farmers to boost yields of potatoes, grains, and dairy, contributing to the regime's self-sufficiency drives without direct complicity in its atrocities. Yet beneath this facade of rural normalcy, Louis Ferdinand quietly dissociated from the regime's horrors, refusing to join the Nazi Party or endorse its policies publicly. He witnessed the war's ravages from afar, the Eastern Front's brutal campaigns against the Soviet Union, the Holocaust's systematic extermination unfolding in nearby occupied territories, and the Allied bombing raids that began intensifying by 1942, but his isolation at Cadenham provided a buffer, enabling him to focus on family life with his wife Kira and their growing children. Their household became a haven of stability, where Orthodox and Lutheran traditions mingled, and the prince composed music in spare moments. His stance, however, inevitably drew scrutiny as the war progressed, and internal opposition to Hitler swelled within Germany's elite circles. By 1944, with the Allies advancing on multiple fronts and the German war machine faltering, discontent among officers and civilians reached a boiling point, culminating in the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Orchestrated by figures like Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who planted a bomb during a briefing, the conspiracy involved a network of military leaders, intellectuals, and aristocrats, disillusioned by the regime's failures and moral bankruptcy. Although Louis Ferdinand was not directly involved in the planning or execution, likely prioritizing his family's safety and avoiding actions that could endanger his wife and young children, he maintained significant contacts with resistance circles. He was closely associated with key plotters such as Stauffenberg himself, the conservative politician Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, who was slated to become chancellor in a post-Hitler government, and others like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus, Otto John, and Field Marshal Georg von Küchler. Documents from the underground movement later revealed that Louis Ferdinand was seriously considered as a potential future head of state if the coup succeeded. His Hohenzollern lineage seen as a stabilizing force in a restored constitutional monarchy. Goerdeler, a staunch monarchist, viewed him as an ideal candidate to bridge Germany's imperial past with a democratic future free from Nazi tyranny. These connections stemmed from shared social networks among the Prussian nobility and anti-Nazi conservatives, where discreet meetings in estates or Berlin salons allowed for whispered discussions of regime change. The plot's failure unleashed a wave of reprisals, with Hitler ordering ruthless purges that claimed over 5,000 lives, including executions of Stauffenberg, Goerdeler, and many others. Louis Ferdinand's name surfaced in investigations, leading to his arrest and interrogation by the Gestapo in the aftermath. Hauled in for questioning, he endured intense sessions where agents probed his associations and loyalties, seeking confessions of complicity amid the regime's paranoia. Though he denied direct participation, the ordeal highlighted his delicate position, a man of conscience navigating fascism's horrors without committing to full rebellion, balancing personal survival with moral integrity. Remarkably, he was released after several weeks, possibly due to lack of concrete evidence or interventions from sympathetic figures within the military elite, but not before being briefly imprisoned at Dachau concentration camp, where he witnessed the regime's brutality firsthand. This brush with death underscored the perils faced by aristocrats suspected of disloyalty. Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief, had advocated for the extermination of all German princes, proposing they be paraded through Berlin for public humiliation before execution, their properties seized for redistribution to loyal Nazis. Hitler himself accused the Hohenzollerns, particularly Louis Ferdinand's father, of instigating the plot, ranting that the crown prince is the actual instigator. Yet Louis Ferdinand's release spared him the fate of his associates, allowing him to return to Cadenin under heightened surveillance until the war's end. Post-war investigations by Allied forces, including denazification tribunals established in occupied Germany, thoroughly examined his record and cleared him of any complicity with the Nazi regime. American and British interrogators, drawing on intelligence from captured documents and survivor testimonies, affirmed his non-collaboration, recognizing his quiet opposition and resistance ties as evidence of integrity rather than culpability. This clearance enabled him to rebuild his life in the ruins of a divided Germany, where he emerged as a symbol of moral continuity amid national reckoning. Throughout the war, Louis Ferdinand grappled with profound moral dilemmas that encapsulated the broader tragedy of a divided Europe. His pre-war aviation work, which involved contributing to aircraft development at firms like Lufthansa or Junkers, was later criticized by some historians as indirect support for the Nazi war machine, given the Luftwaffe's role in bombing campaigns and the industry's integration with rearmament efforts. Defenders, however, pointed to his early ban from service and resistance connections as proof of measured opposition, arguing that he navigated a treacherous landscape where outright defiance could mean death for his family. These years tested his resilience to its limits, blending the imperatives of personal survival, protecting Kira and their children from reprisals, with the ethical weight of witnessing atrocities like the Holocaust and the Eastern Front's genocidal warfare. Rarely discussed insights from his post-war memoirs and private correspondences reveal a man haunted by inaction, confiding to friends that the war's horrors exposed the fragility of human decency, yet his choices reflected a pragmatic humanism, prioritizing subtle dissent over suicidal heroism. In letters to exiled relatives, he expressed regret over the regime's perversion of German traditions, writing that the true battle is within, against the darkness that claims our souls. His contacts with the resistance, while not leading to direct action, positioned him as a potential bridge to a post-Nazi order, a role that underscored his internal conflict, loyalty to his nation's people versus revulsion at its leaders. As the Red Army advanced into East Prussia in 1945, forcing the family to flee Cadenin amid evacuations and chaos, Louis Ferdinand's wartime odyssey encapsulated the Hohenzollerns' fall from power, their estate lost to Soviet occupation, mirroring Europe's broader fracture. These experiences forged a deeper wisdom, teaching him that survival demanded not just courage but cunning, a lesson that would define his post-war advocacy for reconciliation and democracy in a shattered world. Leadership, business, and cultural pursuits, 1945 to 1977. The war's conclusion in 1945 left Germany in ruins, a once mighty nation reduced to rubble-strewn cities, displaced millions, and a moral reckoning with the horrors of the Holocaust, and total defeat as Allied forces converged from east and west to dismantle the Third Reich. The unconditional surrender on May 8th marked not just the end of hostilities, but the beginning of a profound transformation, with the country divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France, setting the stage for the emerging Cold War that would split Europe into ideological blocs for decades. Berlin itself became a microcosm of this division, quartered among the powers, while the Nuremberg trials exposed the regime's crimes, forcing Germans to confront complicity and rebuild from ashes. For Louis Ferdinand, emerging from the seclusion of Cadinen and the chaos of evacuation as Soviet troops advanced, this post-war landscape demanded adaptation and introspection. Having lost the family estate in East Prussia to communist expropriation, he and Kira relocated westward, initially to the British zone, where they navigated the hardships of rationing, denazification questionnaires, and the stigma attached to aristocratic names in a democratizing society. His wartime dissociation from the Nazis, validated by Allied clearances, allowed him a clean slate, but the emotional scars of loss, friends executed in the resistance, a brother fallen in battle, lingered, shaping his approach to a life no longer defined by thrones, but by quiet stewardship. Louis Ferdinand's father, the former Crown Prince Wilhelm, passed away on July 20th, 1951, at the age of 69, succumbing to a heart attack in Hechingen, a small town in the French occupation zone, where he had lived in relative obscurity since the war's end. This event positioned Louis Ferdinand, then 43, as the undisputed head of the House of Hohenzollern and pretender to the abolished Prussian throne, a title that carried symbolic weight in a federal republic of Germany that had enshrined democracy in its 1949 Basic Law, rejecting monarchy as a relic of authoritarianism. The succession was not merely ceremonial. It entailed managing the family's fragmented assets, advocating for restitution of property seized by Nazis and communists, and preserving the Hohenzollern legacy through archives and traditions. Wilhelm's death, following years of health decline exacerbated by exile and financial strains, left a void that Louis Ferdinand filled with a sense of duty tempered by his unconventional experiences. Unlike his father, who had occasionally entertained Nazi flirtations in hopes of restoration, Louis Ferdinand embraced a forward-looking ethos, viewing his role as a custodian of history rather than a claimant to power. This shift reflected broader societal changes in West Germany, where the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle fueled by Marshall Plan aid and industrial revival, prioritized prosperity over past glories, allowing figures like him to contribute without dominating the narrative. Settling in Bremen, a Hanseatic city in northern Germany that had suffered heavy bombing but was rebounding as a trade hub, Louis Ferdinand embraced a role of quiet influence, far removed from the political spotlight, yet impactful in personal and economic spheres. Bremen, with its resilient merchant spirit and proximity to the North Sea, provided a stable base for rebuilding family life, where he and Kira established a home that blended Prussian formality with modern simplicity. Managing the remaining family estates, such as those in Baden-Württemberg and Lower Saxony that had survived confiscation, involved overseeing forestry, rentals, and historical preservation, tasks that required diplomatic negotiations with occupation authorities and later the West German government. He ventured into business in industry and agriculture, founding or investing in enterprises that range from machinery firms to farming cooperatives, leveraging his technical knowledge to promote efficiency and sustainability. A natural entrepreneur, shaped by the self-made ethos of American industrialists, he drew extensively on his Detroit experiences, where the assembly line's lessons in mass production and innovation informed his approach to post-war recovery. In the 1950s, as Germany rebuilt its automotive and manufacturing sectors, companies like Volkswagen and Siemens leading the charge, Louis Ferdinand applied Ford-inspired methods to streamline operations on his lands, introducing mechanized farming techniques that boosted yields and created jobs for displaced refugees from the East. This practical engagement not only secured financial independence for his family, but also contributed to the broader economic miracle, embodying the era's emphasis on hard work and reconciliation. Analytically, his business pursuits revealed a psychological adaptation. Having witnessed empires crumble, he focused on tangible creation, finding fulfillment in economic agency rather than political ambition, a trait that humanized him in a society wary of elitism. While his public life centered on these endeavors, his true passions emerged in the arts, providing a private outlet for the introspection forged through exile and war. In solitude, he composed melancholic yet hopeful pieces, echoing his inner journey from war-torn exile to quiet healing. This quartet, scored for piano, violin, viola, and cello, was conceived during long evenings in the estate's library, where the distant rumble of artillery inspired motifs of fragmentation resolved in unified chorales. Performed in private salons, hosted at his Bremen home, or among expatriate circles in Paris and London, these works earned him quiet recognition as a composer of some distinction, praised in niche music journals for their emotional depth without the fanfare of professional circuits. Friends and critics noted how his music reflected an inner melancholy born from personal bereavements and historical upheavals, yet infused with optimism. This artistic pursuit offered therapeutic release, allowing him to process the contradictions of his existence, a prince without a kingdom, finding sovereignty in creativity. Deeper analysis reveals how his compositions mirrored broader cultural trends in post-war Europe, where artists grappled with guilt and reconstruction, using abstraction to heal collective wounds. He also authored memoirs like The Rebel Prince, first published in German in 1952 and later translated into English, offering warm, insightful accounts of his unorthodox life that captivated readers with their candor and humanity. The book chronicled his journey from Potsdam palaces to Detroit factories, wartime dilemmas, and philosophical musings on freedom, blending anecdotes with reflections that avoided bitterness, instead emphasizing personal growth. Its success lay in the relatable portrayal of royalty as fallible, with passages on assembly line humility resonating in an era of democratization. In the 1960s and 1970s, as West Germany solidified its role in NATO and the European Economic Community, Louis Ferdinand's popularity surged amid a cultural nostalgia for stable figures in turbulent times. Polls in magazines such as Quick in 1968 and the tabloid Bild in the early 1970s named him the most honorable candidate for the presidency of the Federal Republic, with support reaching an astonishing 55.6% in one survey, despite his complete lack of political experience or affiliation. This grassroots admiration stemmed from his dignified demeanor, pro-Western stance, and perceived integrity, qualities that contrasted with the scandals plaguing politicians during the student protests and economic shifts of the era. He pondered accepting the role publicly, musing in interviews that it could serve the nation, but insisted on retaining his dynastic claims, envisioning a crowned republic where a ceremonial monarch coexisted with parliamentary democracy. Inspired by the Scandinavian and Benelux monarchies, kings like Sweden's Gustav VI Adolf or Belgium's Baudouin, who cycled among citizens, stopping at traffic lights and engaging in everyday life, he proposed a model that embodied democratic tradition while anchoring national identity and history. This vision, articulated in speeches and writings, highlighted his forward-thinking conservatism, analyzing monarchy not as autocracy, but as a stabilizing force in pluralistic societies, a concept that sparked debates among intellectuals about Germany's unresolved past. Family life provided a profound counterpoint of joy and sorrow, grounding his public persona in intimate realities that underscored life's unpredictability. His marriage to Kira, a bond forged in the uncertainties of 1938, endured as a pillar of mutual support until her death on September 8, 1967, at the age of 58, from a heart condition exacerbated by years of stress and exile. Louis Ferdinand mourned her deeply, confiding to a close friend in a poignant letter that "half my melody is gone," a metaphor drawn from his musical world that captured the void left by her absence, the harmony of their shared life disrupted, leaving him to compose solos in solitude. Kira had been his anchor, managing their household through war and reconstruction, raising their 7 children with a blend of Russian resilience and Prussian discipline, instilling values of empathy and education that transcended nobility. Their offspring, 4 sons and 3 daughters, spread across Europe in the post-war decades, pursuing careers in business, diplomacy, and the arts. Some settling in Spain, Switzerland, or Britain to escape Germany's shadows. Notably, several forsook succession rights for love, echoing Wilhelm's earlier choice. For instance, eldest son Friedrich Wilhelm married a commoner in 1967, renouncing claims to prioritize personal happiness, a decision that reflected shifting societal norms where romantic fulfillment trumped dynastic duty. These renunciations, while preserving family harmony, narrowed the line of inheritance, highlighting the Hohenzollerns' adaptation to modernity. The greatest heartbreak came on September 1st, 1977, when his 3rd son and designated heir, Prince Louis Ferdinand Jr., perished at the age of 34 in a tragic military training accident during maneuvers with the Bundeswehr near Mannheim. Serving as a reserve officer in an armored unit, he was crushed by a tank in a mishap that shocked the nation, his death reported widely as a loss of a promising figure who had embodied his father's blend of tradition and progress. This sudden blow thrust his infant grandson, Georg Friedrich, born just a year earlier in 1976, into the line of succession, a poignant reminder of life's unpredictability and the fragility of legacies built on human bonds. Louis Ferdinand, at 69, grappled with profound grief, compounded by the irony of a Hohenzollern falling in peacetime service, yet he channeled it into mentorship, guiding the young heir from afar while advocating for family unity. Analytically, this event underscored the enduring tensions in his life, privilege shadowed by loss, continuity threatened by chance, forcing a reevaluation of inheritance not as entitlement, but as responsibility. In the broader context of 1970s Germany, amid oil crises and terrorism, it humanized him further, reinforcing his image as a figure of quiet strength, navigating personal tragedies with grace. Preservation, Controversies, and Enduring Legacy, 1977 to 1994. In his twilight years, Louis Ferdinand dedicated himself to the causes of historical preservation and justice, channeling his energies into efforts that sought to mend the fractures of Germany's turbulent past while addressing the injustices inflicted upon his family and others. As he entered his 80s, with the physical vigor of youth faded but his intellectual sharpness undiminished, he found purpose in initiatives that bridged personal legacy with national healing. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and Germany's reunification in 1990 presented a unique opportunity, a moment when East and West came together after decades of division, allowing for the reclamation of historical narratives long suppressed under communist rule in the German Democratic Republic. It was in this context that Louis Ferdinand orchestrated the reburial of Frederick the Great, one of Prussia's most iconic monarchs, whose enlightened absolutism and military genius had defined the 18th century. Frederick's remains had been moved multiple times since his death in 1786, first interred at Sanssouci Palace as per his wishes, then relocated during World War II to protect them from bombing, and finally resting at Hohenzollern Castle in West Germany after the war. Louis Ferdinand, recognizing the symbolic power of fulfilling the king's 200-year-old desire to lie eternally at his beloved Potsdam retreat, coordinated with federal authorities, historians, and the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation to facilitate the transfer. The ceremony on August 17, 1991, was a solemn affair attended by dignitaries, including Chancellor Helmut Kohl, where Frederick's coffin was lowered into the crypt at Sanssouci amid military honors and reflective speeches. This act went beyond mere ritual. It symbolized reconciliation between Prussia's storied past and a newly united future, affirming that Germany's democratic present could honor its monarchical heritage without reviving old divisions. For Louis Ferdinand, it was a personal triumph, a way to honor his ancestors' legacy while promoting cultural unity in a nation still grappling with the scars of Nazism and communism, fostering a sense of shared identity that transcended ideological barriers. He also pursued restitution for the vast array of family properties confiscated first by the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s, who seized assets under pretext of Aryanization or state necessity, and later by the communists in East Germany, who nationalized estates as part of land reforms aimed at dismantling aristocratic holdings. These included palaces like Sicilienhof, artworks, libraries, and agricultural lands that represented centuries of Hohenzollern accumulation. Louis Ferdinand's campaign, launched through legal petitions and public advocacy in the early 1990s, involved meticulous documentation of ownership histories, drawing on archives scattered across Europe and testimonies from survivors of the era. Though the process was arduous, facing bureaucratic hurdles and debates over moral culpability, some argued the family's wartime neutrality disqualified full claims. His efforts remained unresolved during his lifetime, with courts deliberating on the validity of pre-1945 titles amid Germany's evolving property laws. Nevertheless, these pursuits catalyzed significant legal reforms, influencing the 1994 Property Act and subsequent amendments that streamlined restitution processes for victims of both regimes. This broader impact aided thousands in recovering assets, from Jewish families reclaiming Holocaust-seized art to Eastern Europeans regaining farms, turning Louis Ferdinand's personal quest into a catalyst for wider justice. His approach was measured and principled, emphasizing documentation over confrontation, reflecting a lifetime of navigating power's complexities with quiet determination. Controversies lingered throughout his later life and beyond, debated with nuance among historians who sought to unpack the ambiguities of his actions in a morally gray era. Central to these discussions was his decision to return to Nazi Germany in 1933, a move that sparked enduring questions. Was it collaboration with a rising dictatorship or mere survival in a homeland undergoing radical change? Critics, particularly in post-war scholarship influenced by Marxist perspectives or Allied narratives, highlighted his contributions to the aviation industry as inadvertently bolstering the regime's war machine, pointing to his work with firms like Lufthansa, where designs fed into the Luftwaffe's buildup, arguing that even passive involvement enabled Hitler's aggressions. They contended that his technical expertise, applied in a context of rearmament, crossed into complicity, especially given the Nazis' use of aviation for propaganda and later bombings. Defenders, however, cited a wealth of mitigating factors. His explicit ban from military service by Hitler himself, which stemmed from perceived unreliability, the harrowing Gestapo interrogation following the 1944 July 20th plot, where he endured threats but emerged unscathed due to lack of evidence, and his documented connections to resistance circles, including figures like Klaus von Stauffenberg and Karl Goerdeler. Some lesser-known accounts from declassified files and private diaries suggest he was even approached by conspirators to assume a leadership role in a post-Hitler government, potentially as a regent or symbolic head, but declined, prioritizing his family's safety over revolutionary risk. This refusal, while prudent, added layers to the debate, portraying him as a man of conscience who resisted without fully committing, a stance that avoided martyrdom but invited accusations of timidity. Posthumously, these controversies extended into family disputes that fractured Hohenzollern unity, revealing the personal toll of dynastic pressures in a modern age. After his death, his elder sons, Friedrich Wilhelm and Michael, who had renounced their succession rights decades earlier to marry commoners, initiated litigation for shares of the inheritance, challenging the traditional primogeniture that favored the direct line through Louis Ferdinand Jr.'s son, Georg Friedrich. The lawsuits, filed in German courts in the late 1990s, centered on equitable distribution of assets, like artworks and financial holdings, arguing that renunciation affected titles but not familial wealth. This internal strife played out in public hearings, and media scrutiny highlighted tensions between outdated house laws and contemporary notions of fairness, ultimately resulting in settlements that granted them portions but strained sibling relationships. Broader debates over the restitution claims pitted ideals of justice against perceptions of entitlement, with some viewing Louis Ferdinand's pursuits as rightful redress for historical wrongs, properties stolen without compensation under totalitarian rule, while others saw them as a relic of outdated privileges, an aristocratic family clinging to wealth in an egalitarian society. Progressive historians criticize the claims as emblematic of unexamined privilege, potentially ignoring the Hohenzollerns' historical role in enabling militarism, whereas conservative voices praised him as a bridge builder, advocating for a monarchical ethos that could heal Germany's wounds through continuity and tradition. Yet, amid these polarized interpretations, Louis Ferdinand emerged as a symbol of moral continuity, a figure who navigated fascism's abyss without succumbing, his pro-Western ties, forged in friendships with Henry Ford and Franklin D. Roosevelt during his American years, subtly aiding Cold War reconstruction by positioning him as a reliable ally in rebuilding a democratic Europe. Louis Ferdinand's legacy extends far beyond these debates, resonating culturally and politically in ways that continue to influence reflections on identity and leadership. He embodied a lost elegance, a refined poise, rooted in Prussian discipline, yet softened by global experiences, evoking a nostalgia for stable, honorable figures in a Germany fractured by division and reinvention. His surprising popularity in presidential polls during the 1960s and 1970s, where ordinary citizens favored him over career politicians, highlighted this sentiment, suggesting a yearning for leadership untainted by partisanship, a moral anchor in times of social upheaval like the student movements or economic shifts. Politically, his vision of a crowned republic offered a thoughtful alternative, blending monarchy's symbolic unity with democracy's accountability, inspiring discussions on hybrid systems that could mitigate populism's rise. Culturally, his music and memoirs preserved a humanistic narrative, reminding generations of the individual's role in history's grand sweep. Ultimately, his adaptability teaches profound lessons on how rigid traditions can evolve without shattering, bending to embrace humility in the face of loss and renewal amid uncertainty, encouraging a balanced view of heritage as a tool for progress rather than a chain to the past. In an age where identities clash and certainties dissolve, Louis Ferdinand's life stands as a testament to graceful endurance, urging empathy for the complexities that define us all. Louis Ferdinand passed away on September 26, 1994, at age 86 in Bremen, interred at Hohenzollern Castle. His grandson Georg Friedrich assumed the family headship, perpetuating a legacy of dignified resilience. At his core, Louis Ferdinand discovered true nobility not in crowns, but in the human spirit's enduring rhythm. His story encourages reflection on our own vulnerabilities, fostering a compassionate view of history's overlooked figures and finding solace in quiet grace rather than splendor. His legacy is not carved in monuments or battles, but in the grace with which he bore witness to a century's collapse, and in the music he left behind, quiet echoes of a man who once bore an empire in silence.